Hi folks, Josh Wolfe with Wolfe Vintage Watches here. Welcome to my shop. Today on the bench I have a Hamilton Acumatic A-506 from 1965. Let's dive right in. This is a customer's watch that was sent in for service, and as received, it's in very good shape. It's ticking and certainly winds and sets. All good signs that this should hopefully be a straightforward service. I'll begin with taking off the strap. The A-506 has a single piece case in stainless steel, so I'll need to remove the crystal before I can get at the movement. It surprised me a bit that this watch has a crystal with a tension ring. Ordinarily this model would just use a plain domed acrylic crystal. The tool I'm using here is called a crystal lift, and it's not the right tool to remove a tension ring crystal, so shame on me for not noticing sooner. The crystal out of the way, I'll remove the hands with a pair of hand levers. Using a piece of plastic to protect the dial and the watch hands, I pry them off the watch with the levers. It always gives me pause to remove these types of crowns. Another consequence of a single piece case is that the watch uses a split stem. Essentially, there are two halves of a stem that fit into each other, not unlike how train cars are joined together. This means, in order to remove the crown, I have to pull hard enough to pull the two halves apart. This model uses a female post on the crown side, which grips onto the male half of the stem that's still in the movement. To get the dial off, I'll loosen these dial feet screws. These screws press against the dial feet, securing the dial to the movement. Looks like both of them were already pretty loose. Now I can gently lift the dial away from the movement using a screwdriver, giving us our first look at the dial side of the movement. This is an automatic movement, meaning that the watch will wind itself using this weighted rotor. The rotor spins around as you move during the day, which, through a series of reversing wheels, winds up the mainspring. Here I'm removing the entire automatic works and will disassemble it in just a bit. On the other side of the movement, called the watchmaker side or train side, I'll let down any remaining power from the mainspring. It's important to do this before taking the movement apart to prevent damaging any parts or scaring the bejeebas out of the watchmaker. Okay, now that there's no power left in the mainspring, we can safely start taking this baby apart. On the dial side again, the hour wheel is first to go. The minute work cock needs to be removed next. This part holds both the minute wheel and the setting wheel in place. It's pretty clear here that this movement has been over lubricated, at least on this side. The minute wheel is sticking to the minute work cock, there's so much oil. It's not super uncommon to run across an over lubricated watch, so I can't say that I'm too surprised. Taking the setting wheel out, it looks like whoever was in here last not only over lubricated it, but also installed it upside down. It might be a little hard to see on camera, but the bottom of the setting wheel is slightly chamfered. This allows for a much smoother time setting feel through the crown. This part is called the canyon pinion with driving wheel, and it's what the hour hand is attached to. The canyon pinion is friction fit into the driving wheel, and I'm checking here for proper tension. Now we can turn our attention to the keyless works. This group of parts are responsible for winding the watch. They're called the keyless works because in the early days of pocket watches, they had to be wound with a key, much like a mantle clock. As technology progressed, as it always does, new pocket watch models were introduced that could be wound without a key using the crown. From then on, the parts that enable any watch movement to be wound using the crown are referred to as the keyless works. Here we can see the male half of the split stem. With the winding pinion and the clutch wheel removed, I'll go ahead and tighten the dial feet screws back down before I forget. If I left them partially unscrewed, they're liable to work themselves loose in the ultrasonic machine, and then I'd have to go fishing in cleaning solvents and rinses. My hands are already dry enough, so I have no interest in doing that. Alrighty, let's tear down the watchmaker side of the movement now, starting with the ratchet and crown wheels. The crown wheel is secured to a separate post with a reverse threaded screw. This prevents it from backing out when the watch is being wound. Now I'll remove the click and the click spring. I very much dislike this style of click spring. It has a round profile, which means not only is it difficult to pick up off a flat surface, like a mat or a parts tray, but also that it slips out easily once you do get a grip with tweezers. And to continue complaining, When it does inevitably slip, the rounded profile squirts out of the tip of tweezers like a grapeseed. I guess what I'm saying is, I'm very careful anytime I'm working with this type of click spring. I'll loosen up and remove all of the bridge screws, including the middle one on the barrel bridge that I somehow overlooked on the first pass. Then, using a screwdriver, I'll pry the bridges up. This is the crown wheel post, which we'll get a better look at during reassembly. The train wheel bridge comes off next. This bridge has all 4 of the train wheel's pivot jewels, which are the 4 red jewels you can see there. I'll give it a quick inspection and, well, we'll get to that later. With the bridges out of the way, we now have access to the train wheels. These are the gears that many people think of when they think of the internals of a watch. The sweep second wheel, the third wheel, the mainspring barrel, the intermediate wheel, and the escape wheel are all removed in turn. I'll now remove the top balance jewel setting. It's held in place by this very fine spring which provides some shock protection for the balance pivots. With the spring up and out of the way, I'll grab the setting, which is actually 2 parts, so I can clean them thoroughly. And I'll reseat the shock spring so it doesn't get damaged or go missing while it's visiting the spa later. With the top jewel removed, I can take out the balance cock and the balance. Like the movement bridges, I'll pry up the balance cock with a screwdriver so I can snatch up the whole assembly safely. The pallet fork is the last piece of what's known as the escapement, and it's held secure by the pallet cock. Here I'm using the light reflection to inspect the faces of both the red pallet stones. These are made out of the same material as the jewels and are what interact with the teeth of the escape wheel. If these stones are damaged in any way, the watch will run poorly and maybe not at all. The setting lever screw is giving me a hard time, so I had to be a little more persuasive here. Okay, last couple of pieces and we're done with the movement. Here I'm removing the bottom balance jewel setting in the exact same way as the top setting. Open the spring, remove the setting and cap jewel, refit the spring. We'll get a better look at the 2 pieces of the jewel setting later once they're cleaned up and ready for lubrication. I'll use an oiler to loosen the KIF Duofix shock absorber here. I'll pry one shoulder of the spring horizontally until the tab clears the setting. Then I'll lift it up slightly and slowly let the tension back down. I use the flat side of a pick to prevent this tiny guy from disappearing. With the spring loosened, I'll nudge it out of the way slightly. There's no need to remove it completely. In fact, it's a huge pain to get it back in place if it is. And using a bit of Rodico, I can just pick up the cap jewel from the setting. As you might have guessed, I'll reseat this shock absorber as well before tossing it in the cleaning machine. Let's get the automatic works disassembled, starting with unscrewing the weighted rotor. These 2 wheels are called Paul winding wheels, and they ratchet in such a way that the watch winds regardless of the direction that the rotor is spinning. They also allow the watch to be hand wound without engaging the entire automatic works. They're held in place with a half-headed screw that just needs to be rotated out of the way to free them. These 2 wheels are called the reduction gear and the driving gear for ratchet wheel. I just need to swing this brace out of the way to get at them. Home stretch for disassembly. To clean the mainspring, I first need to free it from the barrel. By pushing the barrel arbor against a steel block, the cap pops off. Carefully, I can remove the cap, being sure to keep the mainspring securely in the barrel. There's a surprising amount of energy that is stored in this relatively small mainspring, and it's quite thrilling when it's released in a split second of carelessness. The part that I very much intentionally tossed across my work area is the barrel arbor, and with it safely returned to the parts tray, I can begin to walk the mainspring free of the barrel. Starting with the first loop, I work my thumbs underneath the exposed end, keeping pressure on the portion still inside the barrel. Loop after loop, the mainspring slowly, and most importantly, controllably, comes out of the barrel. I think I'll engage super speed now. And here's the empty barrel, ready to join all of its comrades in a hot ultrasonic bath. With the cleaning process complete, it's time to see if I can get this watch back together. Let me know if you'd like to see how I clean the parts in the ultrasonic machine. It's not the most thrilling thing in the world, so I decided not to film it. Here I'm preparing to oil the mainspring. We need to add a thin coating of oil on the mainspring to help prevent binding so it provides a consistent level of power to the watch. I'll add a bit of grease to a folded piece of tissue paper, then pull the mainspring through it. This applies just the right amount of grease across the entire mainspring. This tool is a vintage mainspring winder. It has a small barb on the arbor or post that hooks into the end of the mainspring. Once I get it seated properly, I fit the handle over the mainspring and onto the winding arbor. Flipping the whole thing around so I can hold the handle in my left hand, I start winding the mainspring into the handle with my right. This takes a bit of dexterity to hold everything together so the spring doesn't explode in my face and yet still wind it up. This split end of the mainspring is called a bridle, and it pushes against the barrel wall, holding the end steady. When the mainspring goes beyond fully wound, it will slip so nothing gets damaged. I unwind the arbor and let the spring down and work it out. You can see here how the spring is wound up inside the handle. Getting back to the bridle, I need to add a special barrel grease to the inside barrel walls now. This grease provides the right amount of grippiness for the bridle, but when it slips, it prevents massive scratching and marring of the barrel or damage to the mainspring. The barrel grease applied, it's time to install the wound mainspring. Holding the winding handle firmly in the barrel, the end of the handle is pressed down like a plunger and it pushes the mainspring out. Sweet. Looking good. Here I'm adding some heavy oil to the barrel arbor. This part has a barb on the side that catches the hole in the end of the mainspring. When the watch is wound, either by hand or by the automatic works, it's this part that is ultimately turned to actually wind the mainspring. It can be a little persnickety to get into the end of the spring and through the hole in the barrel, but we'll get there eventually. A bit more oil on the other end of the barrel arbor before the barrel cap is put into place. There is a special tool that applies even pressure to the cap to close it, but squeezing between tweezers has the same results. With our power source squared away, let's get some jewels back in place, shall we? I'll open the Duofix shock up first, so I can slide the cap jewel back into place. Using the sharpest pair of tweezers I have, which look like tree trunks at this magnification, I pull the spring back towards me while applying extremely light downward pressure. Once the tab clears the lip of the setting, the spring will pop into place. And just a little nudge to drive it home. For the lower balance jewel, however, I can lubricate the cap jewel before I put the setting onto it. With the shock prepped and open, I'll add a drop of oil to the very center of the cap jewel. This flat jewel is what the end of the balance pivot rides on. It doesn't take much oil at all here. Once it's lubricated, I place the jewel setting on top of it and the two parts are held together with capillary action. Into the movement they go. And the shock spring is closed up, securing everything in place. The training wheels are inserted back into the watch, starting with the escape wheel, then the intermediate wheel, and then the third wheel. For the sweep second hand, I'll lubricate the extended pivot that the second hand will eventually be seated on. The tool I'm using here is called an auto oiler, and while not necessary to service watches, it sure makes lubricating parts easier. It deposits a set amount of oil very precisely when the trigger is pulled. Some heavy oil is added to where the bottom of the barrel arbor will sit. And lest I forget, I'll put the setting lever screw in now. Okay, here's the train bridge as I received the watch. It's pretty clear here that the center jewel is badly damaged. There's no way I'd let this out of my shop in this condition, but finding the exact right replacement jewel is difficult to say the least. So I picked up a donor Hamilton 689A movement and scavenged this great looking train bridge. You can see what the jewels are supposed to look like here. That'll work perfectly. I'll line up the train wheel bridge as best I can with the 4 wheels and the 2 alignment posts on the main plate of the movement. Then, with patience and a light touch, it's just a matter of making small adjustments here and there for all 4 wheel pivots to line up and for the bridge to drop into place. More often than not, it's the escape wheel that is the last wheel to line up. Here I have all the other wheels in place. I'm just nudging the escape wheel home. There. Nice. Before I screw the bridge down, I'll test for free movement of the wheels. Applying slight pressure with a plastic pick to keep everything steady, I'll screw the train wheel bridge home. On to the barrel bridge. To prep for install, I need to get the crown wheel post back in. It seats into place on the back side of the bridge, and I can hold it there with a bit of Rodico. Flipping the whole thing over, I'll add a bit of oil before screwing down the crown wheel with its reverse threaded screw. That assembly is now refitted into the watch. This bridge is far easier to reinstall than the train bridge. It only needs to line up with the barrel arbor, which is gigantic in comparison to the wheel pivots, and a couple of alignment holes on the main plate. That done, the 3 screws are tightened down. A dab of oil for the top of the barrel arbor, and then the ratchet wheel is installed. This wheel has a square hole that aligns with the square top of the barrel arbor so that when it rotates, it turns the barrel arbor and winds the mainspring. The outer teeth of the ratchet wheel mesh with the crown wheel as well as the automatic works that we'll get to later. And now for my favorite click spring of all time. The part I'm installing here is called the click, and it helps prevent the watch from unwinding as well as makes the clicking sound when it's being wound. It also wins the award for least creative part name in the history of mechanics. The click is pushed by the click spring into the crown wheel, which now can only rotate one way. The pallet fork is up next. I'll line up the lower pivot with its jewel hole and make sure the pallet stones are on the same plane as the escape wheel before I refit the pallet cock. Wiggling the pallet back and forth, once the top pivot is lined up with its jewel, the pallet cock can now be pressed home. And just to make sure we got it right, I'll test again real quick before securing everything down with a screw. Now that the pallet fork is installed, it will hold the train of wheels in place and allow the mainspring to be wound up. Putting a little wind into the mainspring, I'll see if power is making its way through the train of wheels by manually indexing the pallet fork. What I'm looking for here is that the pallet fork will snap to each side after a little nudge with my tweezers. This is a good view of how the pallet stone faces slide against the escape wheel teeth and then stop it completely once it indexes all the way over. I'll use a special grease to lubricate the pallet stone now. This grease is designed to stay in place on the pallet stone without splashing around when under pressure from the escape wheel teeth. This is important since it's so close to the hairspring on the balance wheel. If there's any grease or oil or anything really on the hairspring, the watch will run poorly. With a bit of grease on an oiler, I'll just oil the exit stone of the pallet fork. Believe it or not, just this tiny amount of grease makes a ton of difference in the performance and longevity of the watch. And now let's see if we have a watch that runs by putting the balance back on. If all is well, the balance should start to swing back and forth. Just like that. Cool. No drama at all, which is a good thing. Even without the top jewel, this movement wants to run. So let's get the balance cock secured down and work on getting that top jewel setting lubricated and set back into the watch. The shock is opened up first to get ready. Then, just like the lower jewel, I'll add a drop of oil to the center of the end stone. Then I can pop the jewel back into the balance cock, which will center the pivot of the balance wheel. You can see the balance wheel really take off as soon as the jewel is back in place. Closing up the shock secures the jewel into its setting. This is a good view of how the jewels act as bearings for the pivots of the train of wheels. You can see the pivot poking through the hole and the top of the wheel through the jewel itself. These jewels are incredibly hard and smooth, which reduces friction and improves longevity. And now that we know we have a running watch, it's time to lubricate all the jewels. Using the auto oiler again here. When the trigger is pulled back, it retracts a little needle which allows a set amount of oil through. It takes a minuscule amount of oil to properly lube a pivot jewel, and it's very easy to over lubricate. You can see here that I'm adding just enough oil to be pulled into the pivot hole. I don't want to fill the whole cup of the jewel up with oil at all. There are two different weights of oil that are used for the different wheels. One of the oils is made for the higher spin rates of the balance and escape wheel, while the other is for the slower turning intermediate and third wheel. On the dial side, I'll work on getting the keyless works reinstalled. As you might have noticed, reassembly is basically the exact opposite of disassembly. I start with partially screwing down the setting lever so I'll be able to get the stem back in. Then I use a bit of grease to lubricate the teeth of the clutch wheel and the winding pinion. The clutch wheel is the part that I'm setting back into place right here. It's actually only the clutch wheel that the stem turns. Based on the position of the crown, either in or out, it will either engage the motion works to set the time, or it will engage the winding pinion to wind the watch. This is how you're able to wind the watch without changing the time, and vice versa. Using the same grease, I'll lubricate the male half of the split stem. As I get the stem inserted, you can see how it passes through the middle of the winding pinion and the clutch wheel. The tip of the stem sits in a hole in the main plate, aligning the stem perfectly. With the stem seated, I'll tighten the setting lever down. This will hold the stem in place. Here you can get an idea of how pushing and pulling the stem in and out will eventually move the clutch wheel back and forth. Alright, back to greasing up the points where there is metal-on-metal contact between two moving parts. Not only will this grease protect and extend the life of the watch, but it also improves the feel of the watch. The yoke is the arm that engages with the clutch wheel and does the actual moving of it. The yoke spring is a strong spring that will hold the clutch wheel against the winding pinion when the crown is pushed in. Couple more lubrication points to take care of. You can see that the yoke popped out of position there. I'm lucky it didn't fling itself across the bench, so I'll just wrap up adding grease to where it contacts the setting lever and then get it back into place. For parts that are not under as much pressure, I'll use heavy oil as opposed to grease. What I'm working on now is referred to as the motion works. It's a series of parts that set the time of the watch. I'll get back to the grease for this part though. Adding a bit of grease between the canyon pinion and the driving wheel will give the time setting a buttery smooth feel. I'll rotate it by hand a few times to work the grease in before reinstalling it. The driving wheel meshes with the third wheel, which I'm negotiating with right there. This is how the power from the mainspring is transferred over to the dial side and to the hands. Now I can oil all of the dial side jewels, just like the watchmaker's side. And I'll put the setting wheel back in right side up. The minute wheel needs to mesh both with the canyon pinion and the setting wheel. The minute work cock is now reinstalled. The screw holes on this part are chamfered to allow the screws to sit flush. To make sure it lines up correctly with both holes, I'll only tighten one screw down part way and then screw the other down. Now I can tighten both up, securing the motion works to the main plate. This is the setting lever spring, and it creates the two positions of the crown as well as secures the yoke and the yoke spring. I'm adding grease to the two indices of the spring here. The post of the setting lever clicks into either of these grooves as the crown is pushed in or out. This is what gives you that satisfying feeling when you're manipulating the crown. I'm using my screwdriver here to move the setting lever in and out to move the grease around. Then I'll use some Rodico to clean up any excess. Setting the main plate aside for the moment, let's get the automatic works reassembled. More grease on the two posts for the wheels for protection, and they're secured back down with this little brace. With the framework flipped over, the Paul winding wheels are refitted. Both of these wheels are actually lubricated by dipping them in a special lube that leaves a very fine layer on all the tiny parts. Once the paw wheels are secured with the half-headed screw, I'll test movement from all the wheels. Looks good. To secure the weighted rotor to the framework, I'll first add some oil to the pivot, then secure it with a screw. There are gear teeth on the rotor itself that mesh with one of the pawl winding wheels, so I make sure that they're aligned before cranking down on the screw so I don't damage anything. Dial time. As received, this dial is in great shape. Since it was using the incorrect reflector ring crystal before, the lume on the numerals was completely gone and the lume on the hour markers was crushed. Using a fine set of tweezers, I'll start to clear away any remaining lume. I'm not scratching it off, just using the point of the tweezers to kind of break it up. Man, I wish I could work that fast in real life. Once the old lume is pulverized, I clean it up to all the dust with Rodico. This is a great dial. The linen texture was discontinued by Hamilton in the 1968 catalog, so this watch was probably made sometime between 1965 and 1967. Now I can move on to using a bit of pegwood to be a little more aggressive with removing the old lume and to clean the numerals and markers. When it comes to dials, I try to do as little as possible for two main reasons. First, it is so easy to completely ruin a dial. The paint and the finish on these dials are decades old and can disintegrate if you look at them cross-eyed. Second, I like to preserve as much of the character of the watch as possible as a general rule. There's absolutely nothing wrong with having a dial refinished, but my preference is to keep it original. With the dial cleaned up, let's get to reluming. I use what's called a balance tack to hold the hour and minute hands upside down. I start with the hands first because the lume mixture needs to be a little thinner so it flows across the hands better. I'll start by adding a drop of varnish to a plastic cup. Then I'll add a small amount of luminescent compound that definitely doesn't look like anything else that comes in tiny glass vials into the varnish. For this watch I went with a white lume that glows green. Thoroughly mixing the lume compound into the varnish is critical for an even glow. After my super speed peters out, I make sure to pop any buttles, again to make sure there are no defects in the layer of luminescent paint. Using a wider oiler to pick up a drop of the lume, I apply it to the underside of the hour hand. I have to work pretty quickly here so the varnish doesn't start to kick and get gummy. It needs to flow well so that it bridges the gap and self-levels. And the same process is repeated on the minute hand. I also want to make sure the lume is applied over the entire gap of the hand. It's easy to miss a little bit on either side of the hand, and I'd rather get it right the first time than have to go back and fill it in. Setting the hands aside to cure, we can get going on luming the dial. Since I'll need lume to stay put and not flow, I need to thicken up the mixture by adding more completely legal white powder to the varnish. It might be a little hard to tell, but this mixture is fairly gritty and is the right thick consistency I need to relume the dial. Using a smaller oiler with a finer tip, I get a ball of lume on the end. When I touch where I want the lume to go, this mixture should be thick enough to stick to the dial without running, but thin enough to settle into a nice little sphere of loomy goodness. You can see the lume kind of string out as I pull the oiler away. Then the pip left on the dial settles into exactly the size and shape I'm going for. On the 6, it looked like the pip was just a hair too small, so I quickly added just a bit more lume mixture to it. The trick to all of this is to get the pips in the right location, obviously, but to also ensure they're the right size and all the same size. On this dial, there are also smaller pips on the end of the hour markers. Where the numeral pips are spherical and not connected to the markers, these are rectangular and are basically on the end of each of the markers. Again, I'm focusing on creating a correct and uniform size of these lume pips. Yeah, I'm happy with that. I'll let the loom cure overnight, so the first order of business the next day is to refit the dial. After the dial feet are loosened, I install the hour wheel. This is what the hour hand will be press fit onto. Then I can get the dial into place. With the dial feet in their respective holes, I turn everything over to hold the movement onto the dial with gravity. I apply a little pressure with the tip of my finger to keep the movement in place as I tighten the dial feet screws back up, since the dial could shift as the screws press against the feet. With the dial and movement back in the holder, I can get the automatic works installed now. I first line up the 2 screw holes and then give the rotor an oscillation or 2 back and forth. This seats the teeth of the drive wheel with the ratchet wheel. Not doing this runs the risk of smashing teeth when the screws are tightened down. The screw heads for automatic works are typically blued, which makes them easy to distinguish from all the other screws in a watch. I'm not entirely sure why this is the case, but I'm not complaining. With both screws tightened, I again test for free movement of the rotor. I'm also watching the ratchet wheel to make sure that the automatic winder actually functions as it should. Now let's get the handset reinstalled. Since this watch has a split stem, it'll be far easier to case the movement up first. This way I can pop the crown back on and set the time. Starting with the hour hand, I'll just mount it onto the hour wheel without any consideration of alignment. If this were a day-date watch, I'd have to find midnight, but since this is a time-only model, I'll just slap it on there and adjust with the crown later. After pressing on with the hand press, I line the hour hand up with the 12 o'clock. And now I can refit the minute hand onto the canyon pinion. For the minute hand, I'll need to be precise in aligning it with the hour hand and the 12 o'clock marker. Using a slightly smaller hand press, the minute hand is pressed home. A quick check for clearance here, and a little adjustment with the hand press. As I was moving the hands around, I realized that they weren't moving exactly in sync with the crown. Since I didn't see any damage or missing teeth in the motion works, my bet is that the stem is loose in the crown. I'll take the crown out, and using a pin vise to hold the crown post firmly, I'll tighten the crown back down. I need to be a little careful here not to break off one of the arms of the female split stem. Like I've said, these can be a bit of a pain to source, and it'd be a shame to have to go parts hunting this late in the game. Fortunately, everything worked out and tightened up nicely, which means I can turn my attention to the sweep second sand. There's some patina on the second sand, so I'll give it a light scrub to see if I can clean up any of the bigger or looser pieces. Using a steel machinist block, I'm gently scrubbing the hand with some pegwood. This won't polish or completely shine up the hand, but it won't damage or destroy it either. I'm not going for perfection here, I'm going for preservation of character. With that out of the way, I can refit the second sand onto the watch. I'll drop it into place and press it home with my tweezers. With all three hands installed, I'll check for alignment and clearance. Obviously the hands need to clear each other, but they also need to clear the dial. For example, the hour hand could potentially rub on the face of the dial itself, and the minute and second hands could collide with the raised numerals or markers. And if that weren't enough to worry about, the second hand will run into and scrape the inside of the acrylic crystal if the tip is not angled down a bit. All those fitment issues dealt with, let's get this watch timed up. Here I'm slowing down the watch slightly by moving the regulator arm towards me. Then I'll fix the beat error by adjusting the arm called the mobile stud carrier, which is also the nickname I've given my car as it happens. And after a little back and forth, we can see the final results on the time grapher. Reading the first couple numbers on the top, left to right, there is a 0 to 1 seconds per day gain, which is as good as it gets. The next number shows an amplitude in the 253-254 range, which is right where it needs to be. And the third number of 0.1 milliseconds is the beat error. 0 is perfect, so a 1/10 of a 1,000th of a second is good enough for me. As mentioned during disassembly, the wrong crystal was on the watch when I received it, so I'm going to install a brand new correct one. Even though this crystal is new, it still has some dust and packing schmutz that needs to be cleaned away. To get the bigger chunks, I'll use a puffer to blow my troubles away. Then I'll move over to a more refined technique with a sticky swab. The blue rubbery pad helps clean up the clear sticky end of the swab as it picks up the last bits of dust and paper from the package. Now I can bust out the crystal lift again to refit the crystal. This jig here holds the crystal steady as well as keeps the teeth of the crystal lift aligned further up the side. As it's screwed down, the teeth all compress at the same rate, squeezing the acrylic crystal down just enough to fit back into the case. Another quick visit from the puffer to take care of any last minute stragglers, and the crystal is pressed back into the case. When the crystal is fully seated, I'll loosen the screw on the crystal lift, which will relax all of the teeth. The acrylic of the crystal will expand, pressing itself against the sides of the case. A quick wipe down before getting the strap back on, and there you have it. A 1965 Hamilton Acumatic A-506, serviced and ready to head back to its owner's wrist. To check out other watches I've restored, head on over to wolfvintagewatches.com. Link is in the description below. As always, thank you very much for watching. To support me and my channel, please remember to subscribe, like, share, and leave any comments or questions below. See you next time. Bye.